It was a warm afternoon in the quiet neighborhood where Mrs. Clara Johnson lived. The streets were lined with large trees, their leaves casting cool shadows on the sidewalks. Clara, in her early 70s, had lived here for many years, long enough to know every corner of the area. She had always walked to the local store, her small grocery bag in hand, greeting neighbors along the way. She was a gentle soul, known for her kindness and wisdom, but also for the quiet strength she carried. People admired her resilience, especially for someone who had seen so much in her lifetime. Today, like any other day, Clara made her way to the corner store to pick up a few essentials. She walked slowly, enjoying the fresh air and the simple pleasure of being outside. As she approached the intersection, she noticed Officer Derek Thompson, a local policeman, standing near the curb. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and always seemed to carry an air of authority, even when there was no reason for it. His reputation in the neighborhood wasn't the best. He had a history of being harsh and rude, especially towards the black residents of the area. Clara had crossed paths with him before, and she had always kept her distance, trying to avoid any unnecessary interactions. But today, as fate would have it, their paths were about to cross in a way neither of them expected. Officer Thompson, standing near the curb, noticed Clara coming closer. He didn't move, didn't greet her with his usual nod or wave. Instead, he eyed her with what seemed like irritation. Clara, knowing how sensitive the situation could be, tried to walk around him, hoping to keep things calm. But Thompson wasn't having it today. "Hey, old woman, don't you know people have places to be?" he called out to her sharply. His voice was loud, and it caught Clara off guard. She stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat. She had heard things about Thompson, but she had never expected him to address her like that. Clara was not one to argue, especially not with a police officer, but something about his tone made her stand her ground. The days following the incident felt like a blur for Clara Johnson. She had lived her life quietly, never seeking attention, but now, she was at the center of something far bigger than she ever imagined. The phone calls kept coming, calls from the FBI. The days following the discovery of the hidden file were a blur for Clara. The pressure, the endless meetings, the phone calls from the FBI, and the media, it all felt overwhelming. Yet, through it all, Clara remained resolute. The truth was finally coming to light, and she wasn't going to back down. She knew that what she was doing wasn't just for her, it was for every person who had been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. The tension in the community had reached a boiling point. The story of Officer Derek Thompson's abuse of power had spread far beyond Clara's neighborhood. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct that spanned years, and people were starting to demand answers. The public outcry had reached every corner of the city, with protests, petitions, and calls for accountability flooding in. Clara had become the face of a movement, whether she wanted it or not. She wasn't sure how she felt about the attention, but she knew it was necessary. In the days leading up to the official announcement, Clara spent her time with her family and friends. She knew that the road ahead was going to be difficult, but having her loved ones by her side made her feel stronger. Her granddaughter, Keisha, was there every step of the way, supporting her and reminding her that she wasn't alone. Clara often found comfort in Keisha's quiet presence, knowing that the younger generation was stepping up in ways that made her proud. The day of the press conference arrived. Clara was nervous, her hands shaking as she adjusted her dress. She had never imagined herself standing before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing and microphones in her face. But here she was, the center of attention, with the weight of a community's hope resting on her shoulders. She had never asked for this, but she knew she had to do it. She had to speak for the countless people who had suffered in silence. As Clara entered the conference room, the reporters fell silent. She walked to the podium with her head held high, the flash of cameras surrounding her. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. The room was filled with reporters, some she recognized from local news stations, others from larger networks. But she didn't focus on them. She focused on the truth she had been fighting for all along. "Good afternoon," Clara began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. "I'm here today not just for myself, but for everyone who has been mistreated, for everyone who has suffered in silence. What happened to me on that day, when Officer Thompson threw a trash can at me, was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of abuse, years of people being hurt by someone who was supposed to protect them." Clara paused, letting her words sink in. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she didn't let the pressure overwhelm her. This was her moment to speak the truth. Officer Thompson's actions were not just a mistake. They were a pattern. A pattern of violence, of intimidation, and of racial bias. The FBI has uncovered countless complaints against him, complaints that were ignored, complaints that were swept under the rug. This wasn't just about me. It was about the system that allowed him to keep doing this for years. Clara's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the reporters began to fire off questions, their voices blending together in a cacophony of inquiries. Clara answered each one, her voice steady, but her heart racing. She talked about the pain, the fear, and the realization that the justice system had failed her and so many others. She didn't hold back. This was her truth, and she wasn't going to hide it anymore. As the press conference ended, Clara walked away from the podium, her heart still pounding. She had said everything she needed to say, and she knew that the world was watching. She had exposed the truth, but there was still work to be done. The fight wasn't over. The news spread quickly. That evening, as Clara sat in her living room, she watched the press coverage of the conference. The story was everywhere on the news, on social media, in the papers. The public reaction was swift and loud. People were angry. They were demanding accountability for Officer Thompson, for the police department that had protected him, and for the system that had allowed this abuse to continue unchecked. Clara felt a sense of pride, but also a deep sadness. She had done the right thing, but it had come at a cost. Her life would never be the same. She was now part of something much bigger than herself, and she had to accept the consequences of that. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone. The community was with her. People who had never met her were standing up and demanding justice. They were no longer willing to let this go unnoticed. The next morning, Clara received a call from the district attorney. The investigation had reached a turning point. Officer Thompson was facing charges of misconduct, assault, and abuse of power. The evidence was overwhelming. The DA assured Clara that they would do everything in their power to ensure that Thompson was held accountable for his actions. Clara could hardly believe it. After everything she had been through, after all the fear and doubt, it was finally happening. Thompson would face justice. Clara would not let this go unanswered. She had stood up, and now the system was being forced to listen. As the trial began, the community rallied behind Clara. People showed up in droves, not just to support her, but to demand change. They marched in the streets, they held signs, they spoke out. It was a moment of unity, of collective strength. Clara felt the power of those voices behind her, and it gave her the courage to keep going. The trial was long, and the defense team did everything they could to discredit Clara's testimony. They tried to paint her as someone who was exaggerating, someone who was making a big deal out of nothing. But the evidence was undeniable. The FBI's investigation, the video footage, the witness statements, it all pointed to one thing: Officer Thompson was guilty of abusing his power. In the end, the jury found Officer Thompson guilty on all charges. Clara could hardly believe it. After all the uncertainty, the fear, and the struggle, justice had been served. Thompson was sentenced to prison, and the community began the long process of healing. As the dust settled, Clara found herself reflecting on the journey. She had never wanted to be a hero, but now, she understood what it meant to stand up for what was right. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been hurt by the system. She had become a symbol of strength and resilience, and though she didn't seek the title, she wore it with pride. Clara knew the fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought, still injustices to be corrected. But she also knew that one person could make a difference. One person could change the world, one step at a time. And Clara Johnson had taken that first step. She had shown that even in the face of fear and uncertainty, truth and justice would always prevail. From reporters, from activists offering their support. At times, it felt overwhelming, but Clara had no choice but to keep moving forward. Her side still ached, but it wasn't just her body that hurt now. It was her here. Clara had never imagined that something as simple as a walk to the store would lead her to this point. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, filled with phone calls, interviews, and meetings with FBI agents. She was slowly starting to accept that the world she had always known was not as straightforward as it seemed. Officer Derek Thompson's violent outburst had opened up a Pandora's box of secrets, and Clara was now at the heart of it all. The FBI had told her that they were making progress in their investigation. They had already interviewed a number of neighbors and even some former colleagues of Officer Thompson. But each piece of information they uncovered seemed to lead to more questions. The deeper they dug into Thompson's background, the more troubling the story became. One afternoon, Clara sat down in her living room with Agent Diaz. He had come by to give her an update on the investigation, but Clara couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing inside her. She hadn't seen Agent Diaz in a few days, and she knew that when he appeared unannounced, it meant something important had come up. "Mrs. Johnson," Agent Diaz began, his face serious but compassionate, "I have some news. It's not easy to hear, but I think you should know the full truth." Clara nodded, bracing herself. She had grown used to hearing uncomfortable truths, but this one felt different. "What is it?" "We've found more complaints about Officer Thompson, complaints that go back years," he explained. "Not just about his treatment of black residents, but about his general behavior. There are several instances where people filed complaints about his aggression, his use of excessive force, and his racial bias. Unfortunately, none of those complaints ever led to any real action." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. Why wasn't anything done? How could they just ignore all of this? Agent Diaz sighed, clearly frustrated with the system. "That's the problem. We've discovered a pattern within the department. There are officers who knew about Thompson's behavior but didn't report it. Some even protected him. It's clear that there was a cover-up of his actions. It's not just about Thompson anymore. It's about the culture within the department." Clara sat back, shocked. She had suspected that Thompson's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, but hearing it confirmed made her stomach churn. "So, it's not just him? It's everyone?" "Not everyone," Agent Diaz said, his voice firm. "But enough people to make it hard to get the justice you deserve. We're working on exposing this whole network of corruption. It's going to be difficult, but we're not giving up." Clara took a deep breath. The weight of the truth felt heavy on her shoulders. She had always believed in the system, in the idea that right would triumph over wrong. But now, she was beginning to see that the system had failed her, and so many others like her. As the FBI continued to gather evidence, the public's interest in Clara's case grew. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, people from all walks of life were speaking out, demanding accountability for Officer Thompson's actions. Clara's name was now known by many, but she had mixed feelings about the attention. She was grateful for the support, but the weight of it all was overwhelming. She hadn't asked for any of this, but now that she was in the spotlight, she couldn't back down. In the days that followed, More and more people came forward with their own stories of being mistreated by Officer Thompson. Some had been stopped for minor reasons and had their cars searched without cause. Others had been harassed or physically assaulted by the officer during routine stops. The more Clara learned, the more horrified she became. It wasn't just one mistake or one bad day, it was a pattern of behavior that had been allowed to continue for years. One evening, Clara sat with her granddaughter, Keisha, in the living room. Keisha had been a constant source of comfort for Clara throughout this ordeal. The young woman had been there for her every step of the way, offering support and encouragement when Clara felt like giving up. "Grandma," Keisha said softly, "I don't understand. How could the police let him get away with all this? How could they let him hurt so many people?" Clara looked at her granddaughter, her heart heavy with the weight of the question. "I don't know, sweetie. I really don't know. But what I do know is that I'm not going to stay silent anymore. I can't. Too many people have suffered in silence, and it's time for that to change." Keisha nodded, squeezing her grandma's hand. "You're so brave, Grandma. I'm so proud of you." Clara smiled, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's not about being brave, Keisha. It's about doing what's right. Someone has to stand up, even if it's scary." As the investigation into Officer Thompson continued, the public outcry grew louder. Protests began to take place in the streets, demanding justice for Clara and for everyone who had been hurt by the officer's actions. The city council was forced to respond, and they called for a full review of the police department's practices. Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of pride as she watched the protests on the news. The people were finally speaking up, and they were using their voices to demand change. But it wasn't all positive attention. There were still those who tried to discredit Clara's story, people who believed that the officer had acted in self-defense or that she had somehow provoked him. Some even tried to paint her as a troublemaker, someone who was just out to cause problems. But Clara was undeterred. She knew the truth, and she was willing to fight for it, no matter what. Meanwhile, the FBI continued to gather more evidence. They had been able to link Officer Thompson to several past incidents of excessive force, and the department's failure to take action was becoming more and more apparent. But it was the discovery of a hidden file, one that had been buried for years, that would change everything. In that file, agents uncovered detailed reports of previous complaints that had been marked as closed without any proper investigation. The department had systematically ignored these allegations, protecting Thompson and allowing him to continue his violent behavior. The file contained the names of several officers who had covered up for him, and it was clear that Thompson had been operating with impunity for far too long. The pressure was building. Clara knew that the moment of reckoning was coming. The FBI was preparing to bring charges against Officer Thompson, and the case was about to go public. The district attorney had already begun reviewing the evidence, and it was clear that they had a strong case. Clara, once a quiet woman who had kept to herself, was now at the center of a movement for justice. But even as she prepared to face the next chapter, she couldn't help but feel a lingering fear. What would happen if they didn't win? What would happen if the system failed her again? Clara pushed the thought away. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The truth was out, and she would see it through to the end. For herself. For the people who had been hurt. And for everyone who had been silenced for too long. Every day, she woke up with a sense of dread. The memories of the trash can flying toward her, the pain, and the coldness in Officer Thompson's eyes haunted her. She had tried to keep her composure in front of the FBI agents, but she often found herself alone, thinking about everything that had led up to that moment. Her thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang again. It was the man who had filmed the incident. Clara had learned that his name was Marcus, a local business owner who had witnessed everything from across the street. He had sent the video to the FBI and had been in touch with the authorities ever since. "Mrs. Johnson, Marcus said on the phone, his voice calm but urgent. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're holding up. The FBI is working hard, but they're going to need your full cooperation. This is important. They're gathering evidence, but they need your help." Clara sat on the edge of her bed, feeling the weight of his words. She wasn't sure what else she could do. She had already told them what happened, but there was more. She could feel it in her gut. The officers' actions weren't just a random act of violence, they were part of a bigger pattern. "I'll help however I can," Clara said, though her voice quivered slightly. "But I'm scared, Marcus. What if it all gets covered up? What if they don't believe me?" Marcus's voice softened. "You don't have to worry about that. The FBI has already started digging into Thompson's past. Trust me, they won't stop until they get to the truth. There's more to this than just that trash can. They're looking at everything, his past complaints, his behavior. They're not taking this lightly." Clara nodded, though Marcus couldn't see her. She appreciated his reassurance, but fear still lingered in the back of her mind. What if the system failed her, as it had failed others before? What if the badge meant more than the truth? The FBI's investigation was in full swing. Agents had already interviewed Clara several times, asking her for every detail of the encounter. They wanted to know what Thompson had said to her, how he had acted, and how she had reacted. Every word, every movement was important. Clara felt like she was reliving the moment over and over, but she knew it was necessary. They also began speaking with neighbors and anyone who might have witnessed the event. Many people had heard the shouting, but no one had been as close as Marcus had been. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. Clara didn't realize it at the time, but her experience was just the tip of the iceberg. One morning, the FBI called her into their office. They had gathered enough evidence to begin their formal investigation. Clara felt a sense of dread as she walked into the building. She had been to police stations before, but this was different. This wasn't a routine visit, it was part of something much bigger than her. The agents had asked her to sit down in a small conference room, where a few of them were waiting for her. "Mrs. Johnson," Agent Diaz began, a middle-aged man with graying hair, "we've gone through Officer Thompson's history, and we've found some concerning things." Clara listened closely, her stomach tightening. The agent continued. "We've discovered multiple complaints about Thompson's behavior, particularly toward black residents in this neighborhood. There were allegations of racial profiling, unjust arrests, and even physical altercations. But nothing was ever done. These complaints were dismissed, swept under the rug, and no one followed up. It seems like this has been going on for years." Clara's heart raced as she processed what she was hearing. "Are you saying, this isn't the first time he's done something like this?" Agent Diaz nodded. "No, it's not. And what's more troubling is that some of the officers involved in the investigations knew about his behavior but didn't take action. It's not just Thompson, there's a pattern of complacency within the department." Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We're going to press forward with a formal investigation. We'll need to gather more evidence, talk to more witnesses, and see if we can build a case. But right now, we're focusing on Thompson. We've already contacted the district attorney, and we believe there's enough to charge him with misconduct and possibly more. The important thing is that we have the support of the community, and we'll make sure your voice is heard." Clara nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. She felt a strange sense of relief that the FBI was taking action, but there was also the fear that things might not end the way she hoped. Would justice really be served? She didn't know, but at least now, someone was finally listening. As the days passed, the investigation continued to unfold. The FBI began to contact other people in the community who had come forward with their own stories of being mistreated by Officer Thompson. Clara didn't know all the details, but she was beginning to realize that she wasn't alone in this fight. More and more people were speaking out, and that gave her strength. But the road ahead was still uncertain. Clara had received messages from people telling her to be careful, warning her that taking on a police officer could have serious consequences. She was afraid. She had seen the way the system protected its own, and she knew the odds were stacked against her. But she also knew that if she didn't stand up now, things would never change. One evening, as Clara sat by her window, watching the sunset, she heard a knock on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she hesitated before opening it. When she did, she was surprised to find a woman standing there, a reporter, by the looks of it. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Johnson," the woman said. "But I've been following your story, and I wanted to know if you'd be willing to speak publicly about what happened. The media is starting to pay attention, and we need to make sure the public knows what's going on." Clara was taken aback. She wasn't ready for the spotlight. But as she looked into the reporter's eyes, something inside her clicked. She had to keep going. For herself. For the community. "I'll speak," Clara said quietly. "But I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do." The FBI's investigation was far from over, but Clara was beginning to feel a glimmer of hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but she had made up her mind. She would fight for justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had been mistreated and silenced. The fight was just beginning, but she was ready. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of confusion. "I'm just walking home from." Clara Johnson walked home, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite process. The trash can still felt as though it had struck her heart more than her side. She was angry, hurt, and confused. How could a police officer, someone who was supposed to protect her, treat her this way? She'd lived in this neighborhood for years, always keeping to herself, always doing the right thing. Why had she been singled out? Her side ached, and she had to stop twice on the way home to catch her breath, but she kept moving. By the time she reached her front door, the feeling of shock began to fade, replaced by a deep, unsettling sense of violation. Clara wasn't just physically hurt, her dignity had been wounded. The feeling of being disrespected by someone who was supposed to uphold the law was something she couldn't easily shake off. Inside her house, she sat down heavily on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She didn't know what to do next. Should she call the police? The very same officer who had attacked her was a part of the police force. Would anyone believe her? Would they even care? Clara had heard stories of people in her community being treated unfairly by law enforcement, but this was different. This wasn't just a story she'd heard, it had happened to her. As she sat there, thinking, the phone rang. Clara hesitated before picking it up. "Hello," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "Mrs. Johnson, I saw everything," the voice on the other end said. It was a man's voice, kind and concerned. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. I was the one who recorded the incident." Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what to say. You saw it?" "Yes," the man said. "I was parked across the street, and I couldn't believe what I saw. I thought maybe you'd want to know that I've got everything on video. I've sent it to the authorities." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to have witnessed the attack, let alone someone who was willing to help. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But, what happens now? What do I do?" The man was quiet for a moment before responding. "You don't have to do anything if you don't want to. But I think this is bigger than just what happened today. I'm reaching out to the FBI, and I believe they're going to take action. They can investigate this. Maybe they can get justice for you." Clara felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt since the attack. The FBI? Yes, the man said. They're already looking into it. You don't have to be alone in this. You've been wronged, and someone is willing to make sure the truth comes out. Tears stung Clara's eyes. She wasn't sure what to feel, but for the first time in hours, she felt a small spark of relief. Someone believed her. Meanwhile, across town, in an unmarked car, FBI agents were reviewing the footage. The video had been sent to them by the man in the car, who had already provided his statement to the authorities. He'd seen enough in that moment to know it was important. The agents watched the footage carefully, their expressions hardening as they saw Officer Thompson throw the trash can at Clara. It was disturbing, to say the least. They had expected the video to show an argument, maybe some shouting, but they hadn't expected this level of aggression. The officer's actions were deliberate, and there was no justification for what he had done. It was clear from the video that Clara hadn't done anything to provoke him. "We need to make sure we have everything we need," one of the agents said, his voice low and serious. "This isn't just a minor incident. We're dealing with an officer abusing his power. We can't let this slide." The other agents nodded in agreement. They knew how difficult it would be to take on the local police department, but they also knew that justice had to be done. This wasn't just about one officer, it was about accountability. The FBI had to act swiftly, before the situation was swept under the rug. The team immediately began gathering evidence. They reviewed security footage from nearby buildings, checking if any cameras had captured the incident from another angle. They also interviewed other witnesses in the area, some of whom had heard the shouting and seen the aftermath, but hadn't realized the severity of the situation until later. Back at the FBI office, the investigation grew more urgent by the hour. The agents knew they were dealing with a police officer who had a history of questionable behavior. This incident wasn't the first time Officer Thompson had been accused of mistreating people. There were records of past complaints, but they had never been fully investigated. This time, the FBI would make sure the truth came out. Clara's phone rang again later that evening. It was the man who had filmed the incident. "Mrs. Johnson, I just wanted to let you know that the FBI is taking this very seriously," he said. "They've already started looking into Officer Thompson's background. There's more to this than you realize." Clara's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" The man paused before answering. "I've heard from some people that Thompson has a history of harassment, especially toward black residents in the area. I don't know the details, but I think it's important that the FBI knows. They're going to want to look at everything, every complaint, every accusation." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard rumors, but never imagined it was true. "Why didn't anyone tell me this sooner?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," the man replied. "Maybe they didn't want to make waves. But now that the FBI is involved, things are going to change. They're going to get to the bottom of it. You're not alone in this." Clara sat back in her chair, trying to process everything. She had always been quiet about her struggles, never wanting to stir up trouble. But now, as the FBI began its investigation, Clara realized something important: her voice mattered. The truth mattered. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and interviews. Clara spoke with the FBI agents several times, recounting what had happened, answering their questions. She felt nervous, but she also felt empowered. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a bystander to her own story, she was an active part of the fight for justice. Meanwhile, the story began to spread in the local news. The community was outraged. People who had once remained silent about Officer Thompson's behavior started speaking out, telling their own stories of unfair treatment. The pressure was building, and the public was demanding answers. But for Clara, it was still hard to believe that this was happening to her. She had never imagined that an ordinary walk to the store could turn into something so life-changing. Yet here she was, caught in the middle of something much bigger than she had ever expected. And though she had doubts, she held on to the hope that, in the end, justice would prevail. The store, young man. Thompson's expression darkened. You're walking too slow. You're blocking the sidewalk. People need to get by. Clara's face tightened, but she didn't raise her voice. I'm not in anyone's way. I'm just trying to get home. The officer took a step closer, his face red with frustration. Clara could feel the tension rising, but she didn't want to make a scene. She began to step around him, hoping to avoid further conflict. That's when things escalated. Without warning, Officer Thompson reached down, grabbed a metal trash can nearby, and hurled it toward Clara. It hit her side, knocking her off balance. The loud crash of the can echoed through the street, and for a moment, Clara didn't know what had happened. She stumbled backward, trying to regain her footing, but the force of the blow left her dizzy. The pain was sharp. The trash can had struck her with enough force to bruise, and the shock left her breathless. Her heart raced. She wanted to scream, but instead, she just stood there, in disbelief, staring at the officer. Thompson didn't seem to care. He stood there, watching her, almost as if he expected her to apologize. He hadn't said a word since the trash can flew from his hands. Clara couldn't believe what had just happened. She was in shock, unable to comprehend why someone would act this way. But what she didn't know was that someone had witnessed the entire event. A car, parked just across the street, had been watching the scene unfold. The driver, a man in his 40s, had been on a business call and had seen the officer's aggressive behavior. As soon as the trash can struck Clara, the driver quickly ended his call and grabbed his phone. He had been recording the entire incident. Every moment. Every word. The phone's camera captured Officer Thompson's violent action and the terrified expression on Clara's face. The driver didn't know who to call at first, but his instincts told him this was bigger than a simple street dispute. This wasn't just an angry cop, this was a man abusing his power. As Clara slowly regained her balance and wiped the dirt from her clothes, she noticed the man across the street looking at her with concern. His eyes were wide, and he quickly made a gesture, signaling that he was calling someone. Clara felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, confusion. The shock was beginning to wear off, and she could feel the stinging pain in her side. "Are you all right?" the man called to her, his voice laced with genuine worry. Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was truly all right. Her side throbbed, and her hands were shaking. "I'm fine," she replied, though it wasn't entirely true. She was far from fine. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson had begun to walk away, as if nothing had happened. He didn't look back. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer a hand to help her. Instead, he just turned and walked toward his patrol car, muttering something under his breath about how some people just needed to learn respect. Clara watched him go, still in a daze. The anger that had been bubbling inside her started to rise. She wasn't sure if she should confront him, but a part of her knew that it wouldn't change anything. Instead, she began to walk away slowly, trying to make it to her house. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to make things worse. What she didn't know was that as she walked away, the FBI had already seen everything. The footage, recorded by the man in the car, was now in the hands of an agent who was watching the events unfold from the other side of the street. The officer's violent outburst had been caught on camera, and the agents knew that this wasn't going to be a simple case. In the days that followed, Clara couldn't shake the memory of the trash can flying toward her. The way Officer Thompson had treated her, like she was nothing. But there was something else she couldn't ignore either, the man in the car. He had witnessed everything, and for the first time, she felt like someone cared. Little did Clara know, her life was about to change in ways she never expected, and the truth was going to come out, whether the officer wanted it to or not.